Light is a really big deal. The do's and don'ts are a little bit confusing, but I think it's safe to say Scott Zimmerman has so much information that helps us unpack it to find out the best way to go about for optimal health and setting up our light environment. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to visit. Have listened to a lot of your interviews, especially with my buddies Max Goldhain and Tristan Scott. Love what them and Ryan they're all doing, just bringing awareness around things that we really don't talk enough about. Because as far as it goes with me, trying to figure out with my son's cancer diagnosis, what do we do? Diet was first, and that was the first thing that I felt like we had control of and we could dive into, and what was the appropriate answers and solutions for what we were doing. But Scott, the more we get into it, the more I feel like our environment, and especially light, is vitally important. And so you are the one that has laid out why a lot of that is the case. So if you will, how did you get into what we now are looking at with overall wellness and light?
Well, I mean, I was just looking around, start a company to do some lighting type work. And I went and I started looking around at all the photobiomodulation, the red light therapies, and interviewed Mark Hamlin. And, I kind of was getting this vibe, or whatever you want to call it, that, a lot of the stuff that they focus on is just trying to fix something that's broken. And I became more interested in, well, what is it that the body's doing to protect us all every day and every hour? And the more I dug, the more I started to find that there's all these optical features and optical structures and things like that, and mechanisms that are in place that depend on sunlight. And then when my granddaughter got involved, we had neuroblastoma, it became even more motivational to try and figure out what's going on. Not that I ever had the idea that I was going to be able to solve her problem, but unfortunately, children cancer is one of those things that doesn't get the attention it deserves, in my opinion. It doesn't. There's a lot of people who want to do something to help, but it's really hard to. The medical community is very shy at what they can do because nobody wants to hurt a child, but in some ways you have to kind of dig a little bit deeper or try some things different than what you do with adults. And that was one of the things that really hit me when I started doing the optics of the body, is that children are so much more in tune to sunlight than we adults are. And it's just because they're smaller, so light penetrates deeper into the body. And the more I dug, the more I find that there's all these things where light is being localized in very specific spots. And why? You keep on looking at it, and you kind of start to say to yourself, why is the body going to this much trouble, to localize this portion of the solar spectrum? And the other thing that I think people need to understand is that right now what we're going through is really the largest reduction in solar exposure in human history. We go inside, we stay inside, our children stay inside, they don't play outdoors as much as they used to. And it's kind of crazy, but, sunlight used to represent the largest energy input into the body, but now it doesn't. And that changes a lot of different things once you start looking at how the body localizes certain portions of the spectrum in certain tissues. And, I don't want to get off into the weeds, but there's just some amazing structural things that the body does, builds little structures and that localizes to certain chromophores. And the more you dig, the more you see these, like I say, the structure that's going on. But overall, the problem I have with the biggest problem I have is that, as you said, diet and all these other things are always things that people think about. But for some reason, sunlight's just never on the list. And I don't know exactly why. But being the largest energy input into the body, you would think it would be number one on the list, but it's never that situation. And then with doctors and hospitals, they've kind of created this little artificial environment. With my granddaughter, I just wanted to open up the window, you know, and you can't do that in a
Yeah,
hospital. Get a little fresh air. They don't have no idea whether or not sunlight interacts with certain chemos. Those are the things that I wish that there would be more research on. And all I'm trying to do is highlight that here's a mechanism, here's the structures that you need to look at, and hopefully somebody will put some money and time and effort into really figuring it out and let the body do itself, because I firmly believe that the body is capable of healing itself to a great extent, you know
absolutely,
and that's where I guess I'm coming from.
absolutely. What when I first became aware of light, it was around red light, right? So near infrared, far infrared, with things like the Juve. So actually, it was Dave Asprey listening to podcasts, just trying to make heads or tails out of just the biohacking and understanding that. So I got a Juve early on for Lander, my son. And as Jack Cruz has informed me, that was the worst one that I could have gotten because of flicker. And so he kind of let me have it on that one. So can you explain the need for red light? And I'm trying to make it not too broad of a question, Scott. The need that we have as human beings for red light, and why there may be some positives with the therapy, but why the sun is even more important.
Well, you have to look at it, understand what the spectrum of sunlight is. Spectrum of sunlight runs from 250 nanometers all the way beyond 4,000 nanometers. Okay. And when people talk about red light and near infrared light therapies, they're usually talking about very narrow band emitters that which doesn't represent what sunlight really is. And so, in general, um, a lot of the therapies that are out there basically use what they use because that's the diode that's available, rather than it's nothing that is simulate it doesn't simulate real sunlight in any way, shape, or form. And that's what we've been trying to do with our light sources, is get a broader, that's something that covers as much of the natural spectrum as possible, because I'm not trying to treat anything. I'm trying to create an environment that the body's optimized to be in. And the cheapest thing to do is go out and build a treehouse with your son. I'm just saying, there's a lot of great things to do that involve getting, enough of the full spectrum rather than trying to biohack, as you say. I'm not against red light therapy and near infrared. I think there's some real things that happen and people can see some benefits, but it's usually a treatment trying to fix something rather than trying to set up an
Yeah.
environment that is closer to nature. And that's what I believe is the right way to go. So anyway, but
It's one of those things that you don't know what you don't know. As you're diving in, you're trying to figure out things to apply. And so, what looking back, something that we did is I did have, so he had kidney cancer. It was stage 4 kidney cancer, and had one of his tumors, his main tumor on his kidney removed. Well, what I would do is I'd have him have the little Juve light on his belly, and that was the first thing that we were trying to just kind of incorporate, just for wound healing and just overall. But I think back, and I had him playing outside all the time, all the time. And I don't know that wasn't way more beneficial. Running around, barefoot, we were playing out in the yard. It wasn't like a you see a lot of times with these babies that are ungrowing these treatments where they don't feel good enough to go play. He played all the time. And so what is that doing from an energy perspective? Because I believe that the vast majority, if not all, cancers are going to be mitochondrial in function. And by trying to boost the mitochondria, what is the sun doing? How is that even possible that the sun can help us have energy?
well, you have to. First off, let's get clear what you're talking about outside. One of the problems is that in the industry in general is that they define sunlight as what it is if you're laying out on a beach and baking yourself. The real benefit and what the body's designed to do is to take advantage of the fact that if you're around in your surroundings are a bunch of trees and grass and ground, even ground absorbs visible, but it transmit or reflects strongly reflects near infrared that runs from about 700 nanometers, your red light, deep red lights, out to 1200, 2000 nanometers. So when you're out walking in the forest or climbing back, as I say, building a tree house, you've got to, like nature's already provide you with a set of sunglasses because it's absorbing strongly in the visible. About 80% of the light, that lets us be able to tell the difference between a good snake, a bad snake, a tree, any of these things is being done by absorption in the visible portion of the spectrum. But in the near infrared, those same things, those leaves, those grass, are all strongly about 90% reflective to the near infrared. So your sun is walking around in a near infrared rich environment, which then the body, we know from work by Bob Fosbury and others, where you see some of the pictures he's shown, that penetrates inches into the body. And in fact, some new work that Glenn Jeffrey is doing, where he's showing that you can actually measure through the entire body. If you think about the body as being this solar collector, all he did was he put a sensor on the back, on someone's back, and then let them stand out in the sun, and he was able to measure significant amount of the radiation being pumped into the body or through the body all the way through. So even in the case of, as I said, with children, they're much more in tune to sunlight because literally they are smaller. So, if it only penetrates an inch into you or me, then maybe 50% of our cells see sunlight, if are the near infrared. If you're talking about, a child, it can be almost 100%. And so what happens is that near infrared has been shown, that's where you get into all these treatments where you see all these biological effects, which are true and real. With Glenn Jeffrey, he's shown that walking or getting even a small patch of your back exposed to near infrared is able to reduce your glucose levels by 27%, kick up your carbon dioxide levels significantly. Clearly an indication that ATP is being produced better and more efficiently in the mitochondria, and then you've got all these hormone effects, especially in children, where, the simple act of your child running around is generating a kick up in all the different hormones. In particular, our paper that we did in melatonin research, it was showing that during a stressor, and that's one of the problems with a lot of the data in the literature, especially in the red light and other things, is they don't actually measure things during the event, because what happens is during like exercise or running around, you get this spike in cortisol and melatonin together, even at 9 o'clock in the morning. So what you're seeing is that there's a new kind of homeostasis that's being developed where under the certain stressors you get these effects. And you can actually kind of I argue that when people say, well, I went out to the beach and I'm really tired afterwards, or I did some exercise and I'm really tired afterwards, or I did a cold water immersion and I'm kind of tired afterwards. Well, if you look at it from the transient response of these hormones, it appears that the body always generates an excess of melatonin in response to any of these stressors because it's actually used to suppress cortisol. Cortisol is great you need it for a lot of reasons, but if you constantly, I feel like what we have right now is an artificial environment that's constantly bombarding, especially kids, with stressors, like a cortisol boost. They're either watching some kind of TV thing or they're something that, you and I both know that kids can lock into a TV like nobody's business, and it's because it's giving them a cortisol and dopamine response, so
Yeah.
taking down that cortisol level and increasing the melatonin levels is I think is really the end goal of any kind of environment you're trying to create, because cortisol inherently suppresses the immune system. I mean, it's very important. Don't get me wrong. I'm not knocking that you don't need cortisol, but a lot of it needs to be paired with the counter. It's kind of like any control system. You have a positive and negative feedback, and if one of them's not there, you can get out of control. And that's what I'm concerned about, especially with our artificial environment, is that we're constantly pumping up cortisol levels or other hormones that we don't know. You know, you look at it, and we published our papers on melatonin and cortisol, not because they're the only things that are happening. They're the only things that we actually have data on, because there's only like 5 papers in the world that actually measure these things during stressors. And it's the transient response that matters, not the steady state as much. So anyway, so I think you're doing great things with your kid. It's just a matter of you know trying to figure out whether or not we can get enough to really make a real difference. And I can't give you that, unfortunately.
The melatonin story is massive, and that is very very deep into the alternative treatments and therapies for cancer. And so melatonin being a supplement has been in cancer. To me, it's a no brainer. And Dr. Ritter, who you know well and have worked with, I think a lot of his work on the metastasis and melatonin in general has been incredible. And so if light has that big of an effect on our body's ability to produce such a miracle molecule, we've got to pay more attention to it. And so it drives me crazy when I think back to where our sickest people are and the environments that they're in. So for my kids, for my oldest two, we're homeschooling. And honestly, Scott, my number one reason to do that is the lighting. I don't want them sitting in that lighting for 8 hours a day. And so can you go into a little bit of what is that negative effect of the light in, say, a classroom or a hospital, to where they're confined to the more narrow band of the spectrum, or maybe it's just one light wave? Why is that such a
Well, I
problem for
mean,
these
well,
kids to be under it for that amount of time?
yeah, well, I mean, that goes way back to John Ott, where he tried to show videos of the effect of narrow spectrum light on children, and that kind of got poo-pooed. So, but I think that right now, what we're getting to, what he didn't have access to, is all the information that we've got now. And it's pretty clear that you know Russ has been fighting a battle for 40 years to convince the scientific community that melatonin is produced in all the mitochondria. And again, it's a measurement issue. When you go and you look at all the circadian stuff that's out there, they measure it by laying somebody in a dark room, laid out flat, no exercise, not doing anything, and then they're able to see the rise in melatonin during the night. And so that's it's like you're measuring on somebody who's bedridden. Now, what we were able to show with the transient response is the minute somebody does something, you do exercise, you get a cold shower, you do whatever, you're going to see this boost in melatonin and cortisol and other hormones that is transient. And so it's kind of like, if you look at the work by Figueroa and Ray, they showed that if you shine a LED light on a person for about an hour, you'll see a 27% increase in cortisol. Okay? Now, you won't see an increase in melatonin, but if you were to do that same thing using the entire solar spectrum or doing some exercise or something, you'd see that they actually move together. So part of our problem is that how we measure things. And that's why I'm so excited in so many ways, because the new biosensors that are coming online by Gao and all these others, where they're actually measuring these hormone levels in sweat, on the skin, during, you can do it during exercise. A lot of the sports teams are starting to get into doing this. And then you can start seeing these transient effects, and you can kind of try and start optimizing, I believe, towards, getting a higher level of a better state of hormones, especially in kids. So, but we're just getting to that point. Like I say, Gao did that one amazing set of data where he showed that during exercise it goes up, and that as the exercise progressed, all of a sudden the cortisol started to drop. Well, if you combine that with the Theron data, you see that melatonin is actually suppressing ACTH, which then suppresses the cortisol levels. So, it's a very dynamic system, but it's just another clear indication that the body has, over all this time frame, figured out how to do a lot of stuff to protect itself, and it's not so simple as going and taking a pill type thing. You want to actually create an environment, I believe, that is beneficial, lets the body do its maximum benefit that it possibly can. And I guess that's how I'd say I separate myself from the
What
red light
your
therapy people.
Well, I mean, it makes so much sense. The more it seems like we try to isolate and come up with a solution based off of this very narrow focus, we miss or mess up something else. And I've definitely learned so much. And Scott, honestly, one of the things that just kind of has been overwhelming lately is the more that I learn and the more I have conversations with people that have such a deep understanding in a given field, the more I realize I don't know. And it's even way more complicated than I ever could have dreamed. And so you almost get a analysis paralysis with it at times, and trying to figure out how to make heads or tails out of a lot of these findings and opinions and paradigm shifts. But what you're doing, why is it so important to combine the two technologies with incandescent and LED, how you've done with the light bulbs, and that be something that we're around versus just the LEDs?
Well, as I said, with LEDs, they're tend to be narrowband emitters. So let's start with the simple thing is that when you look, everybody gives blue a hard time. Okay, blue's bad. You got to have sun blocker glasses and all this stuff. Yet we can walk outside and we can be exposed to a blue sky at orders of magnitude higher intensity, and it doesn't bother us. Well, the reality is that we need to start differentiating between what the different things are. Blue from an artificial light source or a display or anything like that is a narrowband emitter that contains no near infrared. Blue in the sky is predominantly near infrared. It's actually, and especially when you start taking in the surroundings, as I said, because it's like you're walking through this integrating sphere where the sunlight is being pumped into it, but all your surroundings are reflecting. So what they call the solid angle, the angle of the solid angle of the sunlight direct on your head there's a limited area that's exposed to, but all your surroundings are reflecting that into you, where it's been filtered, where it's taken out most of the visible and only has near infrared. And near infrared is very unique, as Bob Fosbury showed, is that you can have multiple layers of clothing and it goes right through it. You can, and so you don't have to be running around in a birthday suit in order to get the effect. A light t-shirt, pair of pants, and so you start seeing that there's a difference. Like I say, you don't have people live 100 years under a blue sky. Don't have a problem with it, as to some great extent. But when you start isolating and only providing 40 nanometers of bandwidth in these emitters, then you're causing certain things. Like, I would argue that what Figueroa and Ray actually showed is that cortisol is mainly controlled by melanopsin in your skin and in your eye, which is actually the trigger that causes it to go up. Versus in melatonin, it's actually being generated in your cells themselves in response to the local reactive oxygen species density in those cells. So if you get yourself into this environment where you're constantly pumping up cortisol, but you're not generating high levels of melatonin, because again, like I said, in the near infrared, you're looking at a volume, you're not looking at an area. Most of the papers that you read, especially on red light therapies, they'll talk about milliwatts per square centimeter. So they'll talk about a surface effect. That's not what we're finding. We're finding that it's a volumetric effect. It goes deep into the body, and that gives a lot more. You think about it, you have trillions of mitochondria in your body. It doesn't take much stimulus to generate a lot of hormone, melatonin, if you're getting all those cells kicking, all the mitochondria kicking off at the same time. And that's what Theron showed with his transient response was you start kicking all those muscle cells in, they got tons of mitochondria. It generates melatonin in huge amounts during the day. I mean, he ran the test at 9 a.m. in the morning, got levels of 200 picograms per milliliter, several times higher than you'd ever see at night, and then it would go away. So I liken it to having a tennis ball in your hand. You take a picture, throw the tennis ball up in the air, you catch the tennis ball, and you take another picture. That's what people are, most of the scientific lit is doing. They're ignoring the fact that there's these transient responses that are as big or bigger and maybe even more important for setting up the body's health, I guess, health status or whatever. Um, and you can only measure it in a certain way. So one of the things I learned early on working at a research center is how you measure things is just as important as the actual data that you get, because it's easy to screw things up. The other thing is that bear in mind that the eye while it's an amazing element, is really a pretty lousy sensor of sunlight. I can take a red, green, and blue, and I can trick your eye into thinking it looks just like sunlight, but it's not. And that's where you get into this issue of trying to understand how the body uses the entire solar spectrum, and which is really important. I think the aspect that people are missing. And unfortunately, the DOE has gotten into this business of trying to, make it the light narrower and narrower, and even putting all these windows up that block the near infrared. I don't know whether you have low E glass in your windows or not, but the reality is most of the high efficiency windows nowadays are blocking any near infrared from coming into your house. So it takes that away altogether. So there's a lot of things we're doing that I think is about exactly opposite of what nature does. And I think it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
So
So, Scott, what would be like the worst thing we could do? Like if we leave lights on 24/7 and we sit in it, is that about as bad as it can get with say LED lights 24/7, whether that's the screens in our faces, the overhead, like what can we do worse?
I don't know. I mean, the problem is that there's companies now that have these little necklace sensors that you can actually measure how much time you spend in sunlight versus not, and things like that. That they're coming online. What is it? Quantacom. There's a number of LYS, and I think when you start looking at that, you'll see that and total it up compared to my grandfather or even me when I was a kid. Um, the amount of time it's insidious the way comfort comes in and convinces us to stay indoors more and more. Well, we don't want to have a rain date, so we'll do it inside a gymnasium under artificial lighting rather than being outside, and getting the full spectrum. So it's really kind of I keep on saying it's the largest reduction in solar exposure in human history. It's more than what we had for rickets. It just happens to be a little bit more insidious in that it's hidden because the eye is so easily tricked into thinking that, you know, there's some that what we're looking at is really the same thing as what you get when you're outside. And, how much time do a lot of people spend sitting in front of a computer? Computers you know, the new displays. I mean, look at what happens with the display industry. Everybody wants a bigger, brighter, more contrast, higher speed TV. You know, some of these things are now becoming the major exposure level, or you're getting more light off of the TV than your LED lighting in some cases because they're so big and so bright and all that. And so, I think the thing that we're underestimating is that's a negative input into, especially like I say, into children, where total exposure to that, isolation from being outside, walking around outside barefoot. Who knows? There's lots of things that we do different now than what you and I did when we were growing up. So,
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I think the more that we get into here, just understanding light in general. So I own a farmer's market, and it's an outdoor farmer's market. And my kids come with me. We homeschool at the market, and I think that outdoor aspect of it, it's under these massive, like 100-year-old pecan trees. And so
mhm.
the more I learn from you in this realm, the more I feel passionate about keeping it that way. I think it's so important to be exposed, and what y'all have laid out about the infrared going through the plants and reflecting off the plants and us being able to absorb it better is fascinating. But Scott, help me understand one more thing. So I'm sitting in a podcast studio with the lights. How do I offset any potential negatives? What would your recommendations be on having, the lighting to make things look good, and then helping with, more of the health aspect of it?
Well, I mean, Glenn Jeffrey ran a little. He hasn't published it yet, but he did a little experiment where he had some ladies that were doing some work down in a windowless room with fluorescent in that particular case, and he literally just took a. He's probably one of the world's experts on eye response and how to measure, tell the effect of and aging on eyes. And so he took it. All he did is he put a little incandescent bulb desk lamp, kind of shined it on where the ladies were, and in less than a week he was able to measure a change in their acuity, a positive influence of their acuity. So it doesn't take much, you know, but it takes it on a more
Wow.
continuous basis. One of the problems is that people will go out and, oh, this week I'm going to go to the beach and I'm going to sit there and I'm going to lay out and I'm going to fry and I'm going to tan and I'm going to, that's going to be my. I feel, that's what I'm doing. But then, oh, day after day, they're sitting in this environment that is, not positive for what they're doing and it causing all kinds of issues. And, you know, the body works on time scales of days and months, and if you start, negatively impacting, consistently doing something that is wrong, you can't just fix it with a 5 minute or 15 minute exposure to is my argument and my gripe with the because one of the
Sure.
things with a lot of the red light therapies and the near infrared therapies is number one, they're exposing people to the emitter. Unlike in the visible, like you go and you see a headlight in your face, you'll glance away or you'll glance away from the sun. But in the near infrared, in particular, we don't have eye response. So you could be exposed to some really high levels and not know that it's harmful. And so, at a minimum, I would always point any kind of near infrared or red device to bounce off of a wall or something, so that you're not being exposed directly to the emitters. And is my thing, but you know, it I think that the real problem is that over time we comfort overcomes everything else and we don't spend time outside, so we do spend almost all our time, and that's why some of those little sensors, the LYS sensors, you know he literally a guy named Ulysses, he was talking about and showing me some of the data, and on most of the days that he was indoors he would get 1/10 of what he did when he had just went outside for a while, you know so a factor of 10 is a big deal. and especially when you do that month after month,
Yeah.
year after year, and only get a week to go try and be part of nature. So
S- Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you anymore. So, Scott, what is flicker, and
okay,
why is that a problem?
well, flicker is that you know when we're trying to do lighting, and in a lot of different cases, the light is actually being pulsed, or there is when you've got a bulb screwed in and you get the AC waveform at 60 hertz. So, because the eye is not very responsive to quick changes in light intensity, we don't see it. But virtually almost all light sources, except DC driven ones, have some level of modulation on them. That modulation can be very small or it can be very large. But what it does is that while the eye doesn't respond, there's a work by a gentleman named Professor Peter Light, where he showed that if you look on the actually cellular level, what he was doing was measuring the cell wall potential of individual cells, and he was flashing them with LEDs. And if you look at his data, that shows that clearly that there's the our cells are actually being modulated up into the kilohertz region by changing the light levels. So the industry has what they call pulse width modulation, which is how you actually change the intensity. You actually turn the bulb off and on, basically to to dim things down. Our approach is much different. While we do sell an AC bulb because people kept on asking us for one, I don't try and push it. I actually try and push the DC lamp because it has zero flicker. And I've had a lot of customers, especially women, who can, if they buy both, they can tell the difference between the DC versus the AC bulb. And so I personally am trying to get people to do DC and use what we call analog voltage dimming rather than using PWM or constant current reduction or other techniques, like, which we don't need to really get into. But the bottom line is that there are ways that we could provide lighting that had no flicker. It's just a matter of deciding to do so. And so, in our particular case, the DC lamp we do an AC to DC conversion right at the wall socket. We're using a little wall wart, and then the light has no flicker whatsoever in it, and which is, I think, number one, you don't see that kind of modulation in nature. It doesn't happen except in the very extreme cases that a tiger's about ready to eat you, type thing. So, you know, it's not a natural occurrence to have flicker, and that's what. So I keep on falling back to that kind of a adage is that if I don't see it in nature, I don't want to do it in my house, type thing. And the other thing I think that people need to that
That
just to
makes
get
a lot of sense.
the they need to understand that when you're out in direct sunlight on an optical watts basis, you're exposed to equal amounts of visible and near infrared, UV visible and near infrared. When the minute you go back in the trees, as I said, it absorbs the near or the visible portion of the spectrum, and you get near infrared reflected. So that ratio shifts more to the 2 to 3 to 1. So 3 times the amount of near infrared in optical watts to visible. So it's really these ratios that we're kind of focused in on. In our light sources, we generate 3 times the optical watts in the near infrared that we do in the visible because it mimics the effect of being under a tree. As Bob Fosbury likes to say, Isaac
Yeah.
Newton didn't invent gravity or realize what gravity was because an apple hit him on the head. It was because he was sitting under a tree. So he was thinking better. So, but
I
you
love it.
know, and we also do it because we've done a lot of measurements. One of the few that done a lot of measurements within the black population. I did a paper with Professor John Louis. He's been trying to get the black community to understand that the displacement from the equator up into the higher latitudes is causing a significant amount of issues. They're having a hard time with vitamin D levels, and anxiety effects and all that. So our bulb is really designed to also take into account their needs, which I think are, really important because we don't understand exactly what it's doing on everything. But, why wouldn't we provide it where it doesn't really cost us that much to do it? So.
Right. Well, Scott, thank you for taking the time. There's so much more I want to dive into, as you were alluding to, right there with the melanin story. That aspect is absolutely fascinating too. But tell us a little bit about the company and where somebody can go to order the bulbs and the lamp that you produce.
We're at niralighting.com, and you can order. We're I literally make them myself, so you're going to get. We're the only general service lamp manufacturer left in the United States, and we build them in New Jersey, and we ship them out to whoever wants. So I'm apologizing right off the bat if you don't like what you get. Send it back, and we'll talk about it some more. But it's an interesting situation to be in. The government pumped millions and millions of dollars into the lighting industry, trying to develop the ability to make our own lighting, and it's all moved overseas. And it's an unfortunate situation that I think needs to be corrected. But we're trying. It's hard to do though. But if give us a call
You're
or
doing great,
drop
and
us an
we're going to
email,
get
and you
the
can
word
order.
out.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And like I say, I'm not trying to be a doctor to anybody. I'm not trying to tell anybody what they should do or shouldn't do. I'm just trying to provide them with the paper. I'd be happy to send anybody who wants some papers. They're showing the thing, and they can connect the dots themselves.
Thank you for joining us on Sowing Prosperity. Be sure to follow along across the social media platforms, including YouTube, and be sure to go to sowingprosperity.com.